In some previous interviews, I've drawn attention to Murray Walker's tremendous contribution to the advertising industry with his intervention for Trill. When Trill came to the advertising agency that he was working for, before he became a Formula One commentator, they had 80% of the market, but they wanted to increase their market share. And this puzzle was a challenge to the advertising agency because adding to an 80% market share is difficult. So Murray Walker went away and came back with the tremendous slogan, which was, "A single budgie is a lonely budgie." And in one fell swoop, he managed to double the size of the budgie feed market. And I've referred to this because
several times.
Because it seems obvious that Women's Aid, with maybe more than 80% of the market in the domestic abuse industry, needs to expand, as does any organisation. And the obvious way to do so is to expand the market, not to try and expand their market share, but create a bigger market, and they will then be able to earn more, expand, and be an even more powerful organisation. And the easiest way to do so is to provide services for men. We put this to Rick, and this is the conversation we had with Rick as a result.
So yeah, the issue of the support to male victims is obviously of interest to us, and particularly the issue of support to male victims from services which are predominantly for female victims. So I'm going to concentrate on Wales because that's what I know about, and it has the advantage of being a sort of relatively compact body of services compared to England and the rest of the UK. So I'll concentrate on that. And what I want to do is, if I can make this structured, I want to present it, I suppose, in three parts. The first part is simply looking at the factual position regarding what services are provided to male victims of domestic abuse in Wales. And so I'll run through what I know on that, which, as I'll explain, is a lot more now than it was 2 hours ago. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute.
It's a fast-moving situation, obviously.
It's a steep learning curve if you start from a position of ignorance. Yeah, certainly. The second part is to look at the specifically the Respect toolkit for working with male victims and what that says and how that's developed over the years. And the third bit is the particular involvement of a fellow trustee in the charity that I'm also a trustee of, Both Parents Matter in Wales, in respect of the use of that vetting procedure, which is what the toolkit actually is. Okay, so I've got an awful lot of material. I hope it's not a lot of awful material, but an awful lot of material.
I'm sure it won't be.
So let's start with, let's start just for the sake of people who are not acquainted with Women's Aid. Probably most of your audience are. But Women's Aid is not a single organisation. That's the important thing to get across. It's a federation. In fact, it's actually 4 different federations, one for each of the 4 nations of the UK. So there's a Women's Aid Federation of England, and there's Welsh Women's Aid, which is the Federation for Wales. And so individual Women's Aid charities are invariably localised. So they provide services in one city or one town or one relatively small region. And they're affiliated to the Women's Aid Federation level. So that's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is you shouldn't assume that all domestic abuse services, even those focused on women, are necessarily affiliated to Women's Aid. Some are and some aren't. Okay. So let's just give a a bit of a brief intro to Women's Aid in terms of their, if you like, their ideology or their service ideal. And we can start with a quote from the Welsh Women's Aid National Quality Service Standards. This is important because it relates specifically to the issue of male victims and how they're supported by Women's Aid affiliated charities. So this is what one of their service standards states. Services for male service users are tailored to their needs and are delivered safely using a recognised assessment tool to review risk and needs, which is aligned with the Safer Wales Dean Project assessment tool or the Respect Toolkit for work with male victims of domestic violence and associated standards for supporting male victims. Okay, so it makes explicit reference to these assessment tools which are specific to male victims and the Respect Toolkit in particular. And the other thing is, if you look at, say, the accounts or the websites of individual Women's Aid affiliated charities, you will invariably find a statement of their credo on there, which will read something like this. And this is one that I took from one of the sites, but they all have something like this, if not in this exact form of words. So they say something like, "We're committed to delivering gender-specific services as violence, domestic abuse and sexual violence affects both men and women. However, we acknowledge that evidence indicates that women and girls are disproportionately impacted by violence, and this is a violation of human rights and a cause and a consequence of gender inequality. This means that when these forms of violence are experienced by women and girls, this operates a means of social control and maintains an unequal power relation linking to systematic discrimination, reinforcing women's subordinate status." So it's important to bear in mind that's the sort of ethos that's being promulgated by the Women's Aid affiliated charities. Okay. So that's where you start from that position. And just thinking back to that quality service standard, where they referred to delivered safely there, they actually mean, if you read it in context, delivered safely for women, not delivered safely for men specifically. In other words, they're referring really to the segregation of services so that, for example, you don't put men in women's refuges. That's what that means. And when it says tailored to their needs, it really means tailored to the ethos of the charity, which is what I just read out. That's what it really means. Now,
well, that all sounds fine, doesn't it? It all sounds fine until they slip in the bit about the political context or the sociological context that they interpret domestic abuse to fit into. And then it all goes in a particular direction, doesn't it?
Anyway, that's the sort of background which a lot of your listeners are going to be familiar to, I guess. But what I had a quick and amateurish look at is just using the accounts that are submitted to the Charity Commission or Companies House. I just had a quick look at a sample, not all, but a sample of the Welsh charities that are affiliated to Women's Aid. So I looked at, let's see, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I looked at 9, and there's a lot more than that. I looked at 9, and of the 9, 4 made explicit reference to supporting male victims and gave actual numbers. Most of these charities, in fact, virtually all of them, will have a throwaway line somewhere in the text that says, "We support women, men and children suffering domestic violence, blah, blah, blah." So they refer to men in that throwaway line, but a lot of them have no other mention of men beyond that. So there's no actual substance behind it, which led me to believe in 5 out of the 9 cases I looked at that actually they weren't really supporting men. I might have had that wrong, though. I'll come back to that. But I did look at 4 that explicitly mention support to male victims. So let's just go quickly through those. The first was the one I already knew about, which is Callan DVS. Now, I knew about this because I knew they genuinely support male victims, because there was a big publicity splash a year ago in May last year, because they won an award from the National Lottery for two projects, one of which was family-based, but the other one was for the Compass programme. And the Compass programme was, quote, a specialist resource designed to help male survivors recover from their experience following self-acknowledgement of having been the victim in an abusive relationship. The Compass programme is delivered over an 8-week period, 2 hours per week, and is led by an experienced facilitator in a group setting with other survivors. Now, what I think the publicity blurb actually gave this name, if not, I'm aware of it from some other source, but the one of the people behind the design of that project, the Compass project, is Dr. Sarah Wallace, whose PhD thesis from 2018 is specifically on that subject. And this is what I was referring to before we started recording, in being having gone steeply up the learning curve in the last couple of hours, because I've had her thesis sitting on my hard drive for the last 2 years, and I had a quick look through it when I first saw it and thought, that looks interesting, I must read it. So it then joined the ranks of the hundreds of other things that I've been meaning to read and not got around to. But I had a look at it this morning and realised that what I tried to do in my amateurish fashion has been done vastly better in that thesis. So I'd probably like to take up a bit of time going through some bits of that thesis, because it was a bit of a challenge in a couple of hours to read all 563 pages. So I failed in that. I manfully attempted, but I did pull out a lot of key facts. So I think it's important to go through that, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But the other 3 charities that I spotted do support male victims are Atali Fro, which was previously known as the Vale of Glamorgan Women's Aid. Atali Fro, I think, translates as protection in the Vale, the Vale being the Vale of Glamorgan. And they explicitly mention numbers of men supported in their accounts. And it's about 5 to 7% of their total adult support. Similarly, West Wales Domestic Abuse Service, known previously as West Wales Women's Aid. They also mention explicit support to men. In terms of refuge accommodation, 39 women, 32 children and 2 men. And in terms of floating support, 90 women and 2 men. So again, very small percentages of men, but they are there. And then thirdly, the Domestic Abuse Safety Unit, or DASU, and they also operate a male refuge. And I quote from their accounts, "There are only 2 bed spaces within this property," they're referring to the male refuge there, "and we are unable to accommodate males with their children. However, it will be something that we look to achieve in the future. The demand for the project has been very high, and currently we are the only refuge specifically for males in North Wales." So you can conclude from that there's 2 spaces for men in North Wales. They also actually include a very interesting case study for a male victim. It was the only case study for a male victim I spotted. So those are the ones that I fished out, and I can say a little bit, if you like, about the 5 that don't support male victims, because there's some interesting things from those, such as the one that, well, one of them mentions providing education to children from 8 years upwards, which I thought was a little interesting. I don't know what they mean by education. And another one which mentioned mentoring of boys to understand the consequences of their actions.
Sounds sinister.
Well, it does. That's why. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I mean, the thing that leaps to mind there is, well, do girls not have actions, or do their actions not have consequences? Or, yeah. Anyway, let's move on. The interesting thing here is Sarah Wallace's thesis, which is done the job of looking at support to male victims, specifically in Wales again, a lot better than I have done in my very small survey. So her thesis, which I can copy you if you're interested, the key questions she's trying to address and did address are: what are the needs of men experiencing domestic abuse, and is current service provision meeting those needs?
And what's the answer, Rick?
No.
Okay.
What are the needs considerable? Is the service provision good? And no. Let me read her conclude. That was my bowdlerized version of the conclusions. Let me read what she's actually written rather than putting words in the house. Well, let me read the whole of this because it's quite interesting. From the abstract: knowledge, awareness and understanding of male victimisation is largely absent within policy and academic literature. No, this was interesting. No previous literature was identified that had explored service provision for abused men in Wales.
You've written a book about it, haven't you?
Well, I mean, my book covers a lot of different things. And it doesn't specifically focus on Wales, that's for sure. And she's gone into it in far more detail. But it's interesting, in the academic literature, she found nothing. It's quite shocking, really. But this is the bit that surprised me. And she's got a lot of data on this, which we can look at quickly. Across Wales, 48 domestic abuse and sexual violence services were identified as supporting men. Statutory provision accounted for 4 services, whilst the third sector services accounted for 44 services. And then later on, in terms of conclusions, she says, lack of recognition of male victims and the impact of domestic abuse on them prevented all subsequent needs identified in in-depth interviews from being met. For services, a lack of recognition of the issues has created a perpetuating cycle of unsubstantiated need and limited availability of provision. For male victims, there is a visibility inequality created and sustained by the gendered positioning of domestic abuse. Men are bound by prevailing gender norms and domestic abuse constructs of the male perpetrator and female victim. Abused men are denied equal recognition, are not readily accepted, and victimization remains perceived as inconsequential. These perspectives prevent self-recognition of victimization, hinder help-seeking, and fuel limited provision. That last bit is absolutely spot on as far as the experience in our charity is concerned. These perspectives prevent self-recognition. So men often do not recognize their own abuse. They hinder help-seeking because men know they're not going to be believed, and they don't believe there's much support for them, which there isn't. And fuel limited provision. So it's a vicious cycle. If men don't seek support, then you can erect a narrative of their support not being needed. So that's absolutely spot on.
Could you just recap who Miss Wallace is? Because you introduced her.
Yes.
Because she plays a role in one of these organisations.
Yes, she's well, I don't know a lot about her other than that she did her PhD on this topic, obviously, as I'm reading it. At the University of South Wales, finishing in 2018, but she's a trustee of Mankind Initiative.
Oh, right.
Right.
But that's really, I've never met her, so that's really all I know about her. She does go into some personal history in the thesis, which, as a physical scientist, it seems a bit odd to me, but perhaps that's done in the social sciences. But it is interesting, her background. And there's one particular bit that's very interesting because this is a personal anecdote from before her PhD days, when she was working as a support worker in a service, in an organisation providing service to victims. So she writes this about her own experience. I recall the first time I had contact with a man who accessed the service. At that time, I was a support worker, and anyone assessed as being high risk was referred to an IDVA, that's Independent Domestic Violence Advisor. After assessing him as high risk, I went to discuss the case and referral process with an IDVA. Following a discussion with the service user, the IDVA informed me that he was not a victim but a perpetrator, and I was promptly booked onto the male assessment training, Safer Wales. This experience was the first in which I saw a difference in how men and women were supported. I had no previous or future experience whereby my risk assessment of a female victim was doubted, or where assessment training to determine female perpetration was initiated. So that's clearly what motivated her to pick her particular PhD topic, I would guess, from what's written there. But in addition to that, there's a huge amount of data in that thesis. She's mentioned there the 48 services. She canvassed what sort of services they provide and got numbers of men, numbers of men being supported, also numbers of men contacting them. One of the interesting things that comes out of this, which I had no knowledge of before, is what percentage of those services that she refers to actually do apply male-specific screening? And the answer is 50%. She got that from her surveys of these 48 service providers. So that's interesting. It means not all of them do. Not all of them will be affiliated to Women's Aid, of course. And not all of them necessarily respect that service standard that I read out at the beginning, even if they are affiliated. So you've got to be careful here, I think, about tarring everyone with the same brush, because I've no doubt that there's a divergence of view probably between people providing service at the coalface and people, as it were, at the federation level that are more political, if you like. So there will be a huge range of different approaches, and there's no doubt that genuine support to victims goes on. It's not all window dressing, and it's not all, as cynically you might think, just to grab the funding. There may be an element of that, but how much of that there is extremely difficult to get at.
I wonder how easy some of these organisations that don't particularly, these parts, there's a federation, you say. I wonder how easy it is for individual charities if they don't believe the ideology. Are they left to get on with it, I wonder, or I wonder if they're kind of taken to one side and asked to think again, or, what power does the headquarters have, I wonder? We don't know, but it's an interesting thought, I think.
And it's not only the sort of federation level that might exert influence, but all these charities get the bulk of their funding via local authorities. But I mean, you could equally well claim that some local authorities might have been banging the table and saying, what about male victims? You must also support male victims, which is maybe why all the charities do at least mention men, at least in passing. So it's these are good questions. I'm afraid I have no inside knowledge as to what the answers are. No. And I suspect it's actually a mixed bag, and people that say cynically that it's all a fix and it's all for the money. Well, there's going to be an element of that, but it's a bit too cynical when it comes to, the people that are at the coalface answering helplines and actually working in refuges that actually do support male victims. So
and they're doing good work, yeah, absolutely.
Across the whole of the UK, Women's Aid affiliated charities have something like 7,000 or 8,000 staff across north of 300 different charities. There's going to be a huge divergence in approaches and opinions amongst them, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so where do we go from there? There's an awful lot more in that thesis, but perhaps it would be going into too much detail to go into, except to say I was surprised by the numbers being quoted, because some of them are in the hundreds. I suspect the biggest one is the one from the Dean Project, which is Wales's only male-specific domestic abuse charity. The others will all be services predominantly for women. But there was a lot. And the other thing that it breaks down is what type of service that they're actually seeking, which might be interesting to look at. In terms of the sources of referrals to the services, overwhelmingly they come from the police. Only second after the police, a long way second actually, is self-referral. So there's 790 from the police and 126 self-referral. So it's overwhelmingly coming from the police, which is interesting. And in terms of,
well, I think it reflects the fact that the police are probably the only agency that's really out in the community after 5 o'clock in the evening, or and before 9 in the morning when the people's offices open. In other words, they are fulfilling a huge social work purpose, nothing to do with crime, I don't think, or very little to do with crime.
What we believe is happening in South Wales, at least, is that if a man, as a victim, phones the police for assistance, the person who appears at the door will be from Women's Aid. So certainly there's a strong relationship between Women's Aid and the police force, not just in Wales, but in the rest of the UK. And you can see how that's grown up.
I think you have to be sympathetic to the police, really, because it's not really what they see themselves in the front line to do. They must have other important priorities, and dealing with domestic incidents is not what they really want to be spending their time doing, I'm sure. So it's understandable that they'll try and recruit agencies that offer to help.
Especially ones that are experts in the area. I mean, absolutely, you can understand that. And it's rather like the courts. The courts were not designed to deal with difficulties between parents. They're designed for criminals, and the police are also supposed to be for criminals. So yeah, they're not. But I think what I'm pointing out there, that huge 790 figure from the police as sources of referral, that may be direct to Women's Aid, and it's Women's Aid that then appear at the door. That's what may lie behind that figure. You've got to be concerned that if the person at the door, ostensibly to answer a call from a man seeking help, is from an organisation that has that view in the DNA, the ethos of their organisation, you've got to be a bit suspicious, which is unfortunate if it so happens that the individual in question from the charity is not of that ideological type, which may be the case or it may not, but we don't know, do we? The other interesting there's a lot of interesting things in that thesis, but there's an actual figure for the number of men accommodated in refuges in Wales in the year in question, and the answer was 19. So we saw there were 2 in North Wales. Across the whole of Wales, 19 is the number. So it's quite a small number. Right, should we move on from this to the second bit, which was the Respect Toolkit? So the Respect Toolkit. Respect is one of the cartel, as it's been named, with Women's Aid and Refuge. Big player in this area, and it also has a feminist ethos generally. So they've produced this toolkit for use with male victims. It has a long history. It's now in its 3rd edition. But the focus of it is this issue of, is a man seeking assistance ostensibly as a victim of domestic abuse actually a perpetrator? That's the focus of it. So the current incarnation, the 2019 edition 3, is 107 pages, so I'm not going to read it all. But if you go through it, you'll find that that issue just recurs over and over and over again. So I'll read one section as an illustrative section. This is section 2.4. You will find that perpetrators of domestic violence perceive themselves to be the victims. This is a very common strategy, unconscious or conscious, for perpetrators to use, and one which they may use very effectively if we don't have ways of identifying who is doing what to whom and with what consequences. Commonly, perpetrators whose partners have used some form of self-defense or violent resistance will identify themselves as primary victims in that moment. So that's section 2.4, but you can find the same sentiment expressed in section 4, section 4.2, section 7, section 7.3, and probably elsewhere. So it recurs throughout, and it really reaches the climax, I suppose, when you get to their checklist, because they have a checklist of 23 questions. So this is essentially the vetting procedure that people refer to. Now, remember, this is a man phoning for assistance as a victim, or he claims to be a victim of domestic abuse. So there's 23 questions, and if you look at them, 5 of the questions do indeed relate to forms of abuse which the caller might have experienced. But the other 18 do not. The other 18 relate to, is the person taking the call finding him authentic? That's the word they use. Or they ask questions directly related to the caller's abuse of the ostensible abuser. So 18 of the questions are slanted at identifying whether it's really a perpetrator, and 5 at the issue of victimization. So it's a bit loaded, to say the least. And they actually ask for evidence. In fact, they asked for evidence or absence of evidence. And quite what constitutes evidence in the context of a telephone call, I really don't know. But there's this, they include this bit. Professionals who are skilled and experienced in working with responses to intimate partner violence will be able to use their experience, clinical judgment, and sense of authenticity. In other words, whether they believe them. So it's not really evidence. It's the impression that the person taking the call gets. And so again, you're thrown back on the issue of exactly what sort of person is taking the call, because if they're starting from the feminist ideological perspective, they're going to be strongly inclined to towards the perpetrator possibility.
It is a load of twaddle, isn't it, really? It just is a load of twaddle. It's just rubbish.
I wouldn't dream of being quite so blunt, Sean.
Well, I mean, those of us who've actually had to do some research into human behaviour, and, you use questionnaires which have been properly validated and tested and against some kind of gold standard. If you don't even know what you're talking about, you can't evaluate something. I mean, who knows what they mean by perpetrator? Who knows what they mean by victim? I mean, do they know even what they mean by domestic abuse? Where's the threshold where a quarrel between people becomes domestic abuse? It just is just a load of twaddle, isn't it? And I mean, I understand that you've got limited resources and you can't respond to everybody, but to sit there on the end of a phone thinking you're making a sensible judgment about somebody who's ringing up in a crisis is just ridiculous. I mean, it's pathetic. It's not a serious endeavour.
But it can have terrible consequences.
It has consequences,
can't it?
yeah.
Consequences.
It has
can't
consequences,
it?
yeah.
It's a serious endeavour, all right, but not in the sense that's actually intended or ostensibly intended.
Well, it's hypocritical, isn't it? It's nonsense to lack the insight to recognise that what you're doing is very, well, worse than third rate. It's amateur night. It's pathetic.
Well, it's. I mean, again, the cynical view, which may be the accurate view, is that this is deliberate to minimise the number of people getting through, the number of men getting through this filter. So the numbers of men getting through remain small. So the narrative that domestic abuse is overwhelmingly men abusing women can be maintained for both ideological purposes and cash purposes. That's the cynical view, and it may well be a view which at this level is right. I mean, you've got to remember this toolkit is written by people of the feminist ideological persuasion. I mean, there's a cross-fertilization of staff in respect between Respect and Women's Aid.
Well, they can get away with it as long as nobody challenges them. And if you've got a local authority who's just desperate to say they've got some service available, and if this is what people are offering, then presumably the money flows to them. And nobody wants to ask too many questions because it's just difficult and embarrassing and awkward, and they'd rather get on with whatever else is important to them. Because I don't really believe that any of these people are important to the people who are funding the service. It's a nice to have, response to domestic abuse, but actually what people are really interested in is what the voters are interested in, and it's not domestic abuse.
Yes, but there's a lot of political pressure on providing ever-increasing funding, both from national government and local government.
Well, it's attracting publicity a bit, but the things that voters are really interested in are services every day. And I suspect that one of the reasons why this kind of twaddle can be perpetuated is because actually nobody's asking any serious questions. The people on the end of the phone who are, whether victims or perpetrators, are on the whole the least powerful people in society. What happens to them, what's done to them, is of very little interest to the public or to people in some kind of authority over the public. It's a class problem.
I mean, our service users are more than half unemployed, so there you are.
They're dispensable. They're losers. They're beta citizens. They're not a high priority, and that's why you can get away with this kind of nonsense that's going on, and everybody just pretends it's all right. Let's just nod it through. Making a fuss about it is making a fuss about people who really, they've got enough attention going on, and look at the money we're throwing at them. So stop fussing. It's a disgrace.
It's people's lives messing up, though, isn't it?
Mm.
Well, perhaps we can have at some of the time a more fundamental discussion on the root causes of all these things.
Well, it'd just be a rant. I mean, goodness me, I'm on a rant already. So
you are indeed. I've obviously triggered you in some way.
I sit here listening to this stuff and just think, my God, you leave a professional life where there's high standards, and you hear this is what's going on in the underworld of charitable contributions, and it's pitiful. It's absolutely pitiful.
People don't understand, though, do they? Ordinary people who aren't in these situations have no idea what's being given or what other people are doing,
and what completely
in other people's families.
Hopeless services are being offered to them in the pretense of doing something useful.
And people are donating. That's the other thing. People
stop us, Rick. You'll have to stop us. We've lost it.
No, carry on. No, it's not often I'm the moderate voice.
Well, I think Jill and I have been wading around in these issues about people, the response of various organisations and authorities to people who don't have a voice, whether it's the children of Rotherham or other UK cities who are being raped and abused and trafficked, whether it's the children on the Isle of Jersey who are being raped and murdered, and it's covered up because it's inconvenient to the industries that invest in Jersey. So let's not talk about that. Whether it's men and women whose lives are bitter and unhappy because of hardship and they can't agree on things, and where their voices are suppressed. I think after a few weeks of this, we're reaching a point where really, you end up thinking it's absolutely disgraceful how people at the bottom end of the social scale are pushed about and ignored.
And well, it's worse than that.
Try 8 years.
Yeah.
Try 8 years of being.
Well, I've still got some hair on, Rick, but it's going to be coming out as time goes on. Yeah. I really think there's a problem.
All these things have a sociological origin. Though they're all related, and the family.
Well, sociology is another dubious way of spending your life, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
But,
I mean, my reaction to sociology would be the same as Gandhi's reaction when he was asked about Western civilization, and he said, "Well, I think it would be a good idea."
so with sociology, I quite agree. It would be a good idea, but I fear that a lot of what we're talking about is the way people take advantage of disadvantaged groups. That is, that there's money to be made out of appearing to provide a service to disadvantaged groups, and they get away with it.
It's not just money. It's not just money.
Well, and status, whatever, power of some sort.
You can decry all the services, but the domestic abuse industry is a very powerful political lever. And all the issue of, I mean, you're rightly raising the issue of class, and my goodness, we're going off topic here, but
aren't we?
I date a lot of what's happening now in society to the diminished political clout of the working class when Thatcher made rather too good a job of crushing the unions in 1984. And then the Labour Party, well, not the unions and their political wing, the Labour Party, had to find another source of legitimacy, because working class power, which was working class male power, union-led, had been shown to be toothless. It had been defeated. And that's when they started regrouping in a big way around what we now call identity politics. That's when they started taking up the women's issue and the race issue, and more recently the trans issue. All the equality industry took off then, as the unions became ever more focused on that. That's why, I mean, it's rightly said, the Labour Party have lost contact with their roots, because they've done it by seeking legitimacy elsewhere, and that's hence the collapse of the Red Wall.
Well, we've triggered you today, Rick, as well, so we're all in it now.
I mean, it is class. Right, okay. So, third.
So where were you going with this, Rick? Because we've derailed
where I was
you a
going
bit.
was back to 2017, when my fellow trustee of both Parents Matter Cymru, Anna Reagan, was concerned about the Dean Project. The Dean Project, remember, is the only service provider specific to male victims in Wales. It's actually run by Safer Wales, which I think I'm right in saying is technically a private charity, but it's virtually entirely funded by Welsh Government, so it's sort of a wing of government. She became concerned because she became aware of this vetting issue, and that they were not treating men the same as women. So she complained to her then Assembly member, now the Welsh Parliament, who was not then but is now the First Minister for Wales, Mark Drakeford. And on her behalf, he started what became a series of correspondence with the Welsh office of the EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. So the question that was asked was, hey up, what's going on? This isn't equality. So there was a series of responses from that. And let's just read verbatim how that went. So the first response was received from EHRC in April 2017. And it said the Dean, by the way, is Welsh for man. So the Dean Project is the Man Project. The Dean Project provides support to heterosexual, gay, bisexual and trans men who are experiencing domestic abuse from a partner. The Dean Project has developed 5 guiding principles for its work with men. These include that a clear screening protocol is essential in order to identify and respond appropriately to counter allegations. Screening is not commonplace within services for women because women constitute the overwhelming majority of those abused. Beautiful non sequitur there, isn't it? In our view, it's our view that the practice of screening men is unlikely to amount to direct discrimination because of sex. It's our view that there is a material difference between a man calling a domestic abuse support helpline and a woman seeking support from a similar helpline. Women comprise the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic abuse. That was the initial response, which struck Anne as not satisfactory. So, so she persuaded Mark Drakeford to pursue the matter further, and there was further correspondence, which in the end led to the EHRC seeking external legal advice. Don't know from whom, but clearly from someone, QC, a judge or senior barrister or someone versed in these issues. And they got that advice, and they first communicated the outcome of that direct to Mark Drakeford in October, and then subsequently to Anne herself directly in November of 2017. And the important bit is this. Our view is that a policy of screening male but not female corners to an advice line is likely to constitute direct discrimination in breach of Section 13 of the Equality Act 2010. Although women comprise the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic abuse, this does not mean that a comparison between the way men and women are treated by the providers of the helpline is not a comparison between similarly situated individuals, which of course is what any sensible person would think. But it took a long time to get to that position. You'd think the EHRC would know a bit about gender equality, wouldn't you, without having to go to external legal advice? But there you are. That was the final position, which is quite interesting. A complete volte-face from their initial position. And so well done, Anne and Mark Drakeford, in pursuing that. There was another communication from Mark Drakeford to Anne after Mark had had a meeting with the EHRC. So I'll read you this as well, because this is the final position, I think. I thought I'd just send you this note following my meeting with the Commission on Friday. I wanted to meet to discuss 2 main issues. Firstly, to explore the thinking behind the legal advice secured by the Commission, and secondly, to establish the steps taken by the Commission to disseminate this advice more widely. On the first issue, I don't think I learned a great deal more than the Commission has already set on record. The advice they have received is that if a service is being provided to both men and women, then to treat those individuals differently at the point of contact is likely to represent direct discrimination. The test would need to be applied in each specific set of circumstances rather than being a general rule. As a starting point, however, any service would have to be one provided to men and women, and it seems to me there would have to be first a common point of entry to it. On the second front, I was assured that the Commission has written directly to the 2 organisations in Wales which it believes to be potentially affected by the advice that it has received. I don't know which 2 organisations is referred to there. It has asked for written assurances from both organisations that their current practice is in line with that advice. More broadly, the Commission has written to the Home Office to make them aware of the advice received and is doing the same for the Welsh Government. So on the face of it, a reasonably satisfactory outcome. But there is a bit of a wrinkle there, a bit of a loophole, because you note the bit where it says, provided that the service is being provided to both men and women. And that's where you have to read the small print of edition 3 of the Respect Toolkit, because that edition 3 came out in 2019, after the EHC had promulgated their final advice to the interested parties. So the Respect Toolkit, for the first time, includes these sections. So forgive me for reading this lot out, but it puts everything exactly in context. The first bit sounds hunky-dory and is good. You can't criticise this. Organisations supporting female and male victims of domestic abuse must ensure that their assessment processes are consistent and cohesive. Respect does not recommend the use of a separate assessment process for male and female victims, as there is a risk that one client group might inadvertently be discriminated against by having to overcome added barriers to receive a service. For example, the organisation should decide that both female and male service users are proactively asked about their use of violence and abuse when assessed, or that neither male or female service users are asked. So that's absolutely as you would like to see. But the loophole is organisations supporting female and male victims of domestic abuse. Section 5 says this: the assessment tools and forms that follow, in other words, that set of 23 questions, the checklist, are designed for agencies offering a face-to-face service to male victims of domestic abuse, ideally in a multi-agency setting. Respect does not recommend the use of separate assessment procedures for male and female service users to organisations supporting both client groups. Before using this assessment tool with male service users, the organisation should consider what assessment is carried out with female service users and ensure that neither client group is disadvantaged. So the loophole is, if you're providing service to just one sex, you don't have to be consistent with another service providing support to another sex. So remember, this all started with Anne's concern over the Dean project, which provides services to male victims only. So they, at the end of the day, are still legally entitled to provide, to vet callers. That's the actual end point after all that. But the reason why I've regaled you with all that is that it leaves women's aid organisations who are, as we've seen, providing services to both sexes in an interesting position, especially given what Welsh Women's Aid service standards say. In terms of, the standard is you do employ a toolkit with male victims. Doesn't mean to say individual charities do, because we've seen only 50% do, but 50% do. So they're in an interesting legal position, it seems to me. So that's the punchline of my previous, however long we've been talking.
Yeah, it doesn't alter the fact that the questionnaire is twaddle.
No.
I mean, you know, if you really got a fight to be able to ask those stupid questions, then you know you're really wasting your life. It's just pathetic. But anyway, Rick, where do we end up from the point of view of the Trill analogy? That is the women's charities widening their market so as to absorb some of the problems faced by men in similar circumstances. Do you see that happening?
Well, we've seen that they are supporting men, and there is an analogy with Trill, because that was essentially an observation that was an opportunity to expand the market.
Yeah.
And there is an opportunity to expand the market in terms of support to male victims, because male victims are not getting much support. Whoever's providing it, across the board, they're not getting much support. So undoubtedly there is a Trill analogy there, that there is scope for huge expansion in terms of male support. But the cleft stick that women's aid organisations are in is that they have an ideology which doesn't like to admit there is widespread male victimisation. So what I didn't mention is a lot of these charities provide male perpetrator services. And at a quick look, I would say the funding they get for male perpetrator courses is a lot greater than what they get to support male victims, and is a much bigger part of their service. So, for example, Cardiff Women's Aid get a six-figure sum for male perpetrator programs, specifically the Drive project. We could have a session on the Drive project itself, perpetrator programs are mentioned in many of the other charities' accounts, for example. So there's potential growth industry, but I think they're preferring to grow it in the male perpetrator direction. So I mean, you certainly do have support to male victims, but at a very low level. And it might be because local authorities are saying, we want to see male victims supported. What are you doing for men?
Well, it could be a whole new opportunity.
Well, despite what George was saying about, the message doesn't get through. I mean, a lot of people do talk about these issues. I mean, the voices may not be heard at senior political level, but a lot of people have been agitating for a long time on these issues. I mean, as you've seen from Sarah Wallace's thesis, that's not unique. There's voices going back many years on this.
Well, I mean, we're all for helping, perpetrators, whatever, how you define that. But we've also heard the story about, the offhand approach to domestic abuse perpetrator programs, just perpetuating a model which has been debunked by the people who founded the model. And that's another example of a kind of lazy...
harmful.
It's harmful in the end, but it's a lazy approach to dealing with these problems, kind of quick fix, which doesn't work, but generates some money and interest for the people who are in the industry. It's another bad example of bad practice, as with these telephone vetting procedures. It's just pathetic.
If enough people though start to support the idea that men should have help and should be able to go to refuges and should have the same level of support as women, if Women's Aid won't do it, then presumably other charities will set themselves up and do it.
We just shove the ideology out of the way. I mean, just deal with the problems as they present themselves. It's ridiculous to tarnish what you're trying to do. And the people on the front line are, I'm sure, trying to do a good job and trying to respond to the difficulties they face. But you diminish their ability to do that by imposing doctrines which then devalue some of their clients.
Yeah, the Duluth-based perpetrator programs have been very destructive. And that is definitely a case of the ideology getting in the way of help to anyone, really, because they don't work.
No.
But, there are interventions that do work better, but they're not funded. Well, they've tied it up. The cartel have tied it up because Respect has the stranglehold on accrediting perpetrator programs. Yeah. But generally, the local authorities will fund you as a perpetrator program only if you're accredited, which, if they don't know what's going on, that seems reasonable, doesn't it? But they don't realise they're accrediting something that doesn't work.
No.
What I see happening now, though, because I think it's becoming known even to the non-experts that the Duluth models don't work. And that's why we've seen, I think, the growth of the Drive project. So I think Drive is the growth industry. And my very crude representation of that is it's more of a surveillance system than it is of any therapeutic intervention.
Right.
So that's it. But that's why our line in the charity is, well, are women's aid the best actors? Are they the best man for the job here? Because, look at their ideology. And we tried to support that with a survey where we asked people, we asked male victims, what do you think, we asked them plainly, do you think that support to male victims should come from services specific to male victims and couched in the needs of men? And there was overwhelming support for that from male victims. But we're not, at the moment, we're not winning on that. We get some funding, but it's from the private foundations rather than, we've got a little bit from local authorities now and then, but not a lot. I mean, and really tiny. I mean, the total funding we have it must be about 1,000th of the amount of money funding women's aid charities in Wales. Literally 1,000th, 0.1%, something of that order.
Yeah, well, I think the charities that probably do best are the animal welfare charities. So, take your line and take your position in the queue. But Rick, on that depressing note, I think we're going to wind up, and thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And sorry we had the troubles with the sound system to make it much more difficult to get this across. But thank you very much indeed, Rick.
Thank you, Rick.